On the afternoon of August 18, 1780, Brigadier General Thomas Sumter is asleep under a supply wagon, half-dressed, while dozens of his own militiamen swim in the Catawba River, sleep off captured rum, or lie around their camp with their weapons stacked and unattended. Within minutes, British cavalry will crash into that camp so completely by surprise that Sumter himself barely escapes on an unsaddled horse, and his command will be effectively shattered in a matter of minutes. It is, by any measure, one of the most humiliating defeats suffered by any American commander in the entire war, and it is not, by a long distance, the end of Thomas Sumter's story. 3 months later, the same British officer who nearly destroyed him that afternoon will ride away from a second encounter, having lost more men in a single failed attack than Sumter lost in the entire battle, and will still claim victory simply because Sumter's militia had quietly slipped away in the night, leaving him holding an empty field. Thomas Sumter was, by the summer of 1780, already one of the more forceful and independent-minded militia leaders operating in the South Carolina backcountry. Born in Virginia to a miller and a midwife, given only a rudimentary frontier education, Sumter had served in the Virginia militia decades earlier and later settled in South Carolina, where he became a planter of some means before the war. After the British burned his home earlier in the conflict, an act that reportedly hardened his resolve considerably, Sumter organized local militia into a fighting force that answered mostly to himself rather than any formal Continental Army chain of command, a habit of independence that would repeatedly frustrate the Continental generals he was nominally supposed to cooperate with throughout the war. Through July and early August of 1780, his brigade won real, if uneven, successes against British and Loyalist positions at Rocky Mount and Hanging Rock, cutting into British control of the interior at a moment when organized American resistance in the state had all but collapsed following the fall of Charleston that May. On August 15th, the day before the Continental Army's disastrous defeat at Camden, Sumter's men struck a British supply convoy, capturing dozens of wagons, hundreds of prisoners, cattle, and horses, a genuine and valuable success that briefly made him one of the few bright spots in an otherwise catastrophic summer for the American cause in the South. Then came Camden itself, where General Horatio Gates's larger Continental force was routed so completely that organized American military resistance in South Carolina appeared to be finished almost overnight. Sumter, marching north with his prisoners and captured supplies, learned of the disaster and understood, correctly, that British forces would now turn their full attention toward hunting him down before he could reach safety. What happened next has been picked apart by historians for well over 2 centuries, and none of the retellings are especially flattering to Sumter. Believing the Catawba River provided enough separation from any pursuing British force, Sumter halted his exhausted column to rest near the mouth of Fishing Creek on August 18th, roughly 40 miles from Camden. It was not a disciplined halt. According to multiple contemporary accounts, men lounged in the summer heat, swam in the river, and passed around 2 hogsheads of rum that had been captured from Loyalist traders days earlier, drinking heavily enough that discipline broke down almost entirely across much of the camp. Weapons were stacked rather than kept at the ready, and proper sentries were either absent or badly undermanned given the size of the force resting there. Sumter himself was reportedly asleep, half-dressed, on a blanket beneath one of the supply wagons, apparently as confident as his men that the river and the distance from Camden made a surprise attack essentially impossible. Unbeknownst to him, Banastre Tarleton, the aggressive British cavalry commander already infamous across the Carolinas for his speed and ruthlessness, had picked out a hard-riding detachment of 100 dragoons and 60 infantry, doubling the infantry up behind mounted riders to move faster, after his own exhausted main column could no longer keep pace in the brutal summer heat. Guided in part by information from local civilians sympathetic to the Crown who happened across his path and offered precise directions to Sumter's camp, Tarleton closed the final distance completely undetected. When his advance guard encountered 2 of Sumter's scouts along the way, a brief exchange of gunfire killed both scouts and one of Tarleton's own men, but the noise was dismissed inside the camp as nothing more than militia shooting at stray cattle, and no real alarm was ever raised before it was far too late. Tarleton's charge caught Sumter's camp almost completely defenseless, and the result was close to a massacre. Sumter's men, caught unarmed, half-dressed, or still recovering from the captured rum, had almost no ability to mount an organized defense against a disciplined cavalry charge slamming directly into their unguarded position. Roughly 150 were killed or wounded outright, and somewhere between 300 and 350 more were taken prisoner, gutting a force that had numbered close to 800 men only hours earlier. British and Loyalist prisoners Sumter had been escorting north were freed in the chaos, and Tarleton recovered every wagon, cannon, and head of livestock that had been captured from British supply lines just days before, undoing days of hard-won gains in a matter of minutes of fighting. British losses, by contrast, amounted to only around 16 men killed or wounded, a lopsided ratio that made Fishing Creek one of the most thoroughly one-sided defeats any American commander suffered during the entire war. Sumter himself, woken by the chaos, reportedly fled on an unsaddled horse without his boots, and according to some accounts was briefly knocked unconscious after riding into a low tree branch during his desperate escape. He arrived in Charlotte, North Carolina, 2 days later, entirely alone, having lost his army, his supplies, and for the moment, most of his credibility as a commander capable of protecting the men who followed him into the field. Modern historians remain divided on how much personal blame Sumter deserves for the carelessness at Fishing Creek versus how much credit belongs to the exhaustion of a militia force that had already been marching and fighting continuously for days beforehand, but few dispute that the recovery which followed was substantially his own doing. If you are learning something from this breakdown, take a second and hit subscribe. We cover overlooked reversals and turning points like this every week, and what Sumter does next, after a defeat this complete, is genuinely remarkable. What Sumter did next is the part of his story worth remembering most. Rather than retreat from military life entirely after a defeat humiliating enough to end most commanders' careers on the spot, Sumter began rebuilding almost immediately, and his reputation, oddly enough, seemed to survive the disaster largely intact among the men he had led into it. Word spread of his earlier successes and his personal willingness to keep fighting despite the setback, and volunteers steadily returned to his banner over the following weeks as the shock of Fishing Creek gradually faded. By November, reinforced further by veterans fresh off the American victory at Kings Mountain, where Loyalist forces under Patrick Ferguson had been completely destroyed, Sumter commanded close to 1,000 men again, a full recovery in strength if not yet fully in reputation. On November 9th, his forces repelled a night attack at Fishtom Ford launched by British Major James Wemyss, capturing and wounding Wemyss himself in the process, a small but meaningful reversal that suggested Sumter's men had learned real lessons from the humiliation at Fishing Creek about keeping proper watch. Cornwallis, increasingly frustrated by Sumter's continued resistance despite everything that had already been thrown at him, turned once again to the one officer he trusted to finish the job permanently, Banastre Tarleton. On November 20th, Tarleton caught up to Sumter's force at William Blackstock's plantation on the Tiger River, and this time the circumstances were almost entirely reversed from Fishing Creek. Sumter, now well aware Tarleton was closing in, chose his ground deliberately, positioning riflemen inside the farm's log outbuildings and behind fences, with additional men screened in the surrounding woods, rather than resting carelessly in the open the way his camp had 3 months earlier. Tarleton, whose force numbered only a few hundred men immediately available compared to Sumter's roughly 1,000, made the same kind of aggressive, impatient decision that had served him so well in the past, launching a direct frontal assault with his infantry rather than waiting for his own reinforcements to arrive, and even the odds somewhat. For a brief period, British discipline nearly carried the day anyway, as a small detachment of the 63rd Regiment pushed back an American advance that had opened fire too early, and at too great a range to be effective. But Sumter, directing the battle personally from close behind his own lines, ordered a flanking maneuver against Tarleton's dragoons that closed to within 75 yards before the British even noticed the threat developing on their flank, and the combined pressure from multiple directions began to overwhelm Tarleton's smaller, unsupported force rapidly. It was during this fighting that Sumter himself was struck by a musket ball beneath his left shoulder, a serious wound that he reportedly kept quiet at first specifically to avoid panicking his own men in the middle of the engagement, continuing to direct the battle until the pain and blood loss finally forced him to hand command over to Colonel John Twiggs and retire to the Blackstock farmhouse, where a doctor probed the wound and extracted the ball from beneath his shoulder. When the fighting stopped, the casualty figures told a story almost perfectly inverted from Fishing Creek 3 months earlier. American losses came to only around 3 killed and 4 wounded, an almost unbelievably light toll for an engagement of this scale. British losses, by contrast, ran to roughly 92 killed and 75 wounded, a catastrophic result for Tarleton's smaller attacking force, and one of the heaviest proportional losses his previously dominant legion had suffered in any single engagement of the entire war up to that point. Under cover of darkness that night, Sumter's militia quietly withdrew from the field entirely, carrying their badly wounded commander on a stretcher made of raw bull hide slung between poles, escorted by 100 horsemen across 2 rivers to safety before Tarleton's remaining troops, still waiting for reinforcements to arrive, could organize any effective pursuit of the withdrawing Americans. When Tarleton's full force finally advanced the next morning, they found an empty battlefield waiting for them, and Tarleton reported the engagement to Cornwallis as a British victory on the technical grounds that he held the ground once the Americans had gone. It was, by almost any honest reading of the casualty figures involved, a deeply hollow claim to make. Tarleton himself, after the battle, reportedly remarked that Sumter had fought like a gamecock, a comment that stuck permanently and gave Sumter the nickname history remembers him by, the Carolina Gamecock. Cornwallis, for his part, was blunter still, describing Sumter on more than one occasion as his greatest plague, a British commander's grudging tribute to an opponent he could not seem to permanently remove from the board no matter how badly he was beaten down in any single engagement. Sumter's arc across these 2 battles captures something essential about how the war in the South was actually won, a pattern that shows up again and again across the campaign regardless of which specific commander happens to be at the center of the story on any given day. A single catastrophic defeat, even one as complete and humiliating as Fishing Creek, did not have to be the end of a commander's usefulness to the cause, as long as he could rebuild, adapt, and come back stronger than the disaster that had nearly finished him for good. Sumter's wound at Blackstocks kept him out of the field for months afterward, but his forces, and the reputation he had rebuilt from the wreckage of Fishing Creek, remained a persistent, unresolved problem for Cornwallis for the rest of the Southern campaign that followed. Tarleton, who had built his entire reputation on speed, aggression, and the willingness to attack before his enemy could recover or reinforce, found at Blackstocks that the same tactics which had devastated Sumter's careless, unprepared camp in August could be turned catastrophically against his own smaller, unsupported force once Sumter had learned to fight on his own chosen ground instead of being caught resting in the open. It was the same lesson the British would relearn, at much greater cost still, at Cowpens only 2 months after Blackstock's farm. The Blackstock battlefield near Cross Anchor, South Carolina, is preserved today with a historical marker along the Tiger River, though little physical trace remains of the tobacco barn and farmhouse where Sumter's wound was treated that November night. Fishing Creek's exact battle site, north of present-day Great Falls, South Carolina, carries its own quieter historical markers, a reminder of the low point Sumter's career reached there before he rebuilt it almost entirely from scratch within the span of a single autumn. Sumter went on to serve in Congress and the Senate after the war, living to the age of 97 and dying as the last surviving general officer of the entire Revolution. Sumter's own colonels, men like Edward Lacey and John Twiggs, had grown accustomed to his prickly, independent temperament, and his repeated refusals to place his brigade fully under Continental Command frustrated officers like Nathanael Greene throughout the following year. Even as Sumter continued to tie down British resources, the Continental Army could not spare troops of its own to handle. Standing at either battlefield today, it is worth remembering that the same general who was caught so completely off guard that his own men were swimming and drinking when the enemy arrived is also the general who, 3 months later, inflicted one of the most lopsided defeats any British force suffered in the Southern campaign. Sumter's career proves that a single disaster, however complete it feels in the moment, rarely tells the whole story of a commander or of a war still being fought. If this kind of overlooked reversal is your thing, hit subscribe so you do not miss the next one, and leave a comment telling us which forgotten commander or battle you want us to cover next.